It's again also part of the Microsoft Office. Other ones are things like SQLite, MySQL. I mean, there's other ones that are sometimes used by reporters, but Access is probably the most widely used database program. There are statistical programs when you're trying to do heavier data analysis. SAS is one I don't recommend. I use it a lot, but you have to write a program to make it work. And I learned it years and years ago, and so I tend to use it. There are easier things to do like SPSS. How many of you have worked with SPSS here? Any of you yet? Okay, good. Yeah, it's, if you're taking a master's in like sociology or something like that, you absolutely are going to be using SPSS. It's used for that kind of statistical analysis. R is a statistical analysis language that's free, but it's sort of a heavy learning curve on that. There are mapping programs. Being able to map data is really powerful. Almost every piece of information that we reporters would be interested in have location in it. An address, a postal code, a intersection where accidents are occurring, or things like that. Almost everything has some sort of location as a variable. And if you have that, you can make maps of it. You can show the geographical patterns. That's also powerful. There are other I'll mention Google Fusion tables. In fact, I'll demonstrate a little bit with that. I'm still learning those, but they're again another free way of doing it. And other reporters are doing other kinds of things. They're using geographic positioning system hardware, things that grab locations, and doing their own analyses that way. Creating newsroom intranets, doing lots of web publishing or interactive visualizations of data. The field has really exploded in the last, 6 or 7 years. I mean, I used to be able to, I could say up until probably the late 1990s, I knew how to do everything that was being done in computer-assisted reporting. But by then, the field just started expanding so much that there's now nobody who can do everything anymore. There are just so many different specialties and different ways of applying it and so on that it's grown that fast. Your word processor, how can that be a computer-assisted reporting tool? I mean, that's what you write with, right? I use it as my contact sheet. I don't know if any of you heard the term Rolodex. Rolodex used to be the thing. It was like a card thing where every time you met somebody new, you'd fill out the card, you'd put it in the Rolodex, and then you'd flip through the alphabet to try and find the card you did. I'm really bad with names, so I tend to forget names, but I remember people or things or whatever. So what I do is, let's say I interview somebody who is an expert on snakes, and so I put their information at the bottom of my file. Every time I meet somebody new, I put the information in there: their name, their phone number, email address, when I met them, any other contact information, and then something about them. Snake expert. And then, 5 years later, when I need to once again talk with a snake expert, and I've forgotten this person's name, but I can do a search on my word processing file for snake, and right there it is, even though the page thing by now has hundreds and hundreds of names in it. So in a way, that's a computer-assisted reporting tool. And text editors are good for looking at big data files. Spreadsheets, again, this is what I'll demonstrate after we take a break here before too long. Think of a spreadsheet as smart paper, okay? In fact, the term spreadsheet actually was used decades ago, first by accountants. And it was basically paper that had very light rules on it, lines and rows, to help accountants write in with pen the amounts of money that they were taking care of in banks and things like that. So it would all line up nice and neatly. And that's really what a spreadsheet does, is it keeps that, except it's smart. It allows you to do useful things, sorting and filtering and so on. The modern spreadsheet, like Microsoft Excel, will hold over 1 million rows of data. So again, you have to have a really big data set to need something stronger than Microsoft Excel. It'll also hold more than 16,000 columns of information. that many variables. I've never had a data set that had more than, I guess probably 500 variables is probably the most I've ever had. So 16,000 is, that's overkill. But 1 million rows, every once in a while I've in fact run into that limit. I've had to use things. You can use spreadsheets to change the order, to sort the data in more interesting ways, to filter, which means to look at only records that meet certain conditions, the things that you're actually trying to focus on. It lets you transform the data by creating new variables. I'll give you examples of that shortly. And to summarize the data. If you have information that has categories, let's say a category like sex, gender in there, you can use the spreadsheet to collapse that down into the number of records that fall into each category, for instance, and I'll show you that as well. Here's an example of a spreadsheet. In fact, this is the one we'll play with shortly. It's crimes in Portugal. I got it off the INE site. I pulled it into here. I did a little bit of cleanup to make it look pretty and have the yellow top and so on. But this is your data. This is the kind of stuff you guys have available to work with. And there's I think we have about 300, if I recall correctly, different municipios in there. Okay, so we'll play with that here shortly. Database managers. I mentioned Microsoft Access. If you've got a spreadsheet that'll hold 1 million records, what do you need a database manager for? Well, a couple of reasons. Access will handle even larger ones, and every once in a while you will have a project where you will have millions of records. For instance, I'm doing a project now with an investigative group in California. We are looking at a hospital company in California that has 13 hospitals that is they're basically defrauding the government. What they're doing is they're taking patient records and making it sound like the patients are sicker so that the government, using Medicare, will pay more money to the hospital. And the way we are trying to prove this is by taking all those hospital records, which are public record in the United States, not the names of the individuals, but information about each of the patients that goes in, and using the computer, analyzing the data to see whether the percentage of patients that have these rare, expensive diseases are substantially higher in this group of hospitals than they are in other hospitals. And in fact, that's what we found. It's great. I mean, I'm having a great deal of fun doing this kind of thing. But only with a computer could you do this, because the last group of records I looked at had 43 million records in it. This is not something I'm going to be sitting and flipping through paper to do. So that's a perfect example of a story that could not be done without the computer. So anyway, it'll work with large tables. It also will join tables. It'll take two different tables, and if you have some common piece of information, we'll put them together. Examples. Let's say you have a table that has the list of all the people that have been in prison in your state, and another list of all the people who are working in the schools in your state. Teachers and staff people and so on. If you take those two lists together and merge them by some common variable like name or social security number or something like that, what do you wind up with? What do you think? Teachers who are criminals. Okay, to people who probably shouldn't be working in the schools. They've had thing like that. They've had some problem. Another example is, people arrested and convicted of drunk driving, people who have school bus driver licenses. Put those things together by the driver's license number, you wind up with school bus drivers convicted of drunk driving. I'm not sure I want my children going to school with somebody who drinks on the way to taking them to school. So anyway, that ability to take two entirely different pieces of information, bring it together and create new information is one of the things you can do with Access. Statistical programs, I mentioned SAS and SPSS. Actually, Excel will do good statistical things as well. You can calculate, a bunch of very basic statistics and even some more exotic things. But we use them for, calculating averages and ranking things, finding the median, doing statistical tests like a chi-square test, which lets you see whether the pattern that you're seeing, whether it's actually real or it just might be random. Doing actually a simple statistical thing called linear regression, which is a way that you can compare two variables and see if they are correlated together, see if one is closely linked with the other. In fact, this linear regression is how they're discovering the cheating in school test scores. Because again, there should be a very strong correlation between last year's test scores and this year's test scores. So that ought to be strong, and it's the schools where it's way off, where there is a big difference, really stands out when you do linear regression. So we're using those things. Mentioned mapping. The programs that do this kind of thing are called Geographical Information Systems Software, GIS. And there are a variety of those kinds of things. It's being used for all kinds of different information. I mentioned crime mapping. This is actually what police departments do as well. Looking at census data, looking at traffic accident locations, studying the patterns of elections. All these kinds of things can be done with mapping programs. Here's the kind of thing you can do. Here's, I just happen to have a picture of Brazil. And this is the same thing with some data mapped onto it. Very quickly you can create maps that go ahead and show you whatever the pattern is you're interested in. I mentioned that there is software that is free. Okay, things that you don't actually have to pay for, like Google Docs. It has a spreadsheet. It's free. It's online. It's not quite as powerful as Excel, but for many of the kinds of things you might want to do, it's perfectly adequate. There's also Open Office, which is a sort of similar to Microsoft Office in terms of the kinds of things it'll do. It has a word processor, a spreadsheet program, and so on. A spreadsheet program called Calc. You can download that for free, and you don't have to pay for Excel. Google Maps has a My Maps feature. Not only can you see things, but you can actually take your own data and make maps and put dots on it or color in areas and so on. Google will do that for you. And this Google Fusion Tables, which I'll try and show you some examples of a little bit later, lets you do even more powerful things with mapping. Here's a quick example of a Google My Maps. You may recognize the city. This is Lisbon, and those are all the restaurants and bars that I ate and drank at last year when I was here. So you can see I was in all the important places, and I kept track of those so I could find them again. Okay, other kinds of precision tools that are used in computer-assisted reporting. I mentioned public opinion polling. This is I think, a powerful and useful thing for news organizations to do. If we don't do it, we're going to have to rely on, the politicians to do the public opinion polling. And they'll only tell you the things they want you to hear. So it's, it should be, it's good for us to be able to do independent kinds of things like that. We can do experiments. We can do things like, I once did a project looking to see whether different parts of Miami were getting better or worse service by mail than others. We actually mailed a whole bunch of different envelopes all at the same time, all over in different parts of the city, sending them to different parts of the city, and then kept track of when all those envelopes arrived, just to see if the mail service, that all the neighborhoods were being treated fairly. Turns out they were. So this was an example of one where we at least discovered something good about Miami. That was kind of nice. Mentioned intranets, creating online maps, satellite imagery. There are reporters who are using satellite imagery to, one great example was to measure the shrinkage of the Everglades in South Florida. The Everglades is this huge watery area that's very important to the ecology of Florida. The trouble is the builders and developers have encroached on the Everglades enough that there's been substantial substantial amount of shrinkage of it, and by using satellite imagery, we were able, not me, I wasn't involved in this project, but they were able to measure, the number of, hectares or square miles of it that were being lost by this. And data mining is another thing. So anyway, all these kinds of things are being